everyone. Welcome. I hope your quizzes went well, by the way. Welcome to week 7, lecture guide number 5 on the arts of ancient Greece. This is going to be a fairly long lecture, just so you know. So it's going to be broken up into at least 2 parts along the way. We have to cover a time period roughly from around 800 or so BCE all the way up until the 1st century BCE here, with our focus being on the classical period of Greece, which is somewhere between 480 BCE and the middle of the 4th century, so the middle of the 300s BCE. So with that in mind, let me give you a little history before we get started. What you're looking at here on the screen again is a picture of contemporary Greece, a little bit different picture, of course, than Egypt or Mycenaean culture or obviously the Aegean cultures. And here's a map of the area that we're talking about. So if you look at this map, you will notice areas that off to the right-hand side move into the Persian Empire, which you'll hear a little bit about when we get to the classical period. Then, of course, you remember Crete down here at the bottom of the image. Primarily, where we'll be spending our time is on the Greek mainland, right through here. This area around Athens is known as Attica. We'll be spending some time there, a lot of time there, and then we'll be spending some time as well on the Peloponnesian Peninsula, mainland Greece, over here. And we'll be moving from things that look like the bronze image of the hero and centaur from the geometric period around the 8th century BCE on the left here, towards things, and I won't be showing you this, but just so you know the progression, towards things that look a lot like this Hellenistic sculpture of the 3rd or 2nd century BCE over on the right-hand side. So from things that look quite schematic and geometric, which of course is the name of the time period we call this, all the way up to things that look incredibly realistic, or as I'm going to ask you to consider, idealistic. They're not really meant to look like real things. They're meant to look realistic, but more ideal, more like the perfect rendition of things in the world. Or from things like this, a geometric warrior, again bronze, from the 8th century BCE, towards things that are classical sculptures, such as this Ryachi warrior from the 5th century BCE. We start with pottery. The first period that we're talking about is usually known as the geometric period. These are all subcategories, by the way, of a period known as the Archaic period in Greece, which goes from around 800 or 850 BCE up till around 480 BCE. Geometric patterning in pottery, which was the main art form, is the earliest form of painting that we still have extant to us. These pots originally started as a form of consumer item. They're very popular, just like we saw in Minoan culture, being used in many households for many different reasons. That we call them vases, but they're really pots, right? They were meant to do things, include hold materials ranging anywhere from wine to grains to smaller vessels used for perfumes and makeups and so forth. As well as objects that were used in funerals, which we'll get to briefly here. So a little bit of the back history to the story. As we saw, somewhere in the middle of the 1200s BCE, the Mycenaean culture collapses. There's still a little bit of a mystery surrounding what exactly happened to this culture, but most scholars believe it had something to do with warfare that led to the eclipse of that culture. Now, for 300 to 400 years, Greece is in a little bit of a kind of dark age. We don't really know what was going on. There are no written records. There's very few objects that are produced or buildings made during this time period. And it's not until these pots start to show up that we start to see the slow but inexorable move towards greater and greater development within Greece towards the classical period. During this time period, too, we see the development of one of the first organized governmental systems that eventually will become what we know as democracy. Although I'll let you in on a secret here, Greek democracy, though highly vaunted and incredibly important to the rest of the Western world as time goes by, was not a democracy open to all. Only citizens were able to participate in voting or in government, and that was a very limited few. Only men, only people who had been born in Greece, only people of what we would call today a higher class. But it starts during this time period with an entity known as the polis, or poli. Polis is a city-state. It's not so dissimilar than different types of city-states that we've seen so far. Although in this case, if you think of Greece as a very big country today, there are innumerable little poli, or city-states, within that overall Greek-speaking area of the world. The polis then is the organizing principle for a city, and while it is governed differently in different parts of Greece at different times, you can think of it as evolving generally in this way. It originally starts as a basically kind of democratically elected government, people chosen from the upper echelons of society, smart people, willing to sacrifice their own good for the betterment of the city-state, are put into positions of power. Within, and this goes differently at different times in different places, but within a couple hundred years, around the 600 BCE mark, we start to see more and more very powerful families or powerful leaders either elected or taking over various city-states, these poli, to govern. And they're, by the way, known as tyrants, which is where we get the term today, although it doesn't appear that they were all horrible people. Some of them were just very powerful leaders who were governing with the permission of the electorate during this time period. These things will change right around the time of the classical period. In the around 600 we get the first major reforms, but around 490 or so you get the big reforms that will lead to something more like a contemporary democracy. So back to these potted forms. We won't spend a ton of time on the geometric forms, but we do want to point some things out. Number one, the vast majority of these are thrown on a wheel again, so they are relatively uniform in the thickness of the walls of the pot. They come in various different shapes, which are known by particular names. This in front of you, for instance, is a geometric amphora, and you'll see a couple of these. Amphoras have a relatively small opening at the top and a wider area around what's known as the shoulders of the pot. You're going to go through this, by the way. This is the opening or mouth. This is the neck. These are the shoulders. This is the belly of the pot and the base of the pot down here. Handles, of course, on each side. So mouth, neck, based upon human principles, right? Shoulders, belly, base. In any case, these pots originally are just decorated with geometric patterns, but those geometric patterns are very consciously placed in various areas to emphasize the shape of the pot, just as we saw in my Minoan culture, for instance. Here, for instance, and if you remember back to the cycladic figurines that are very much based upon perfect proportions, the widest part of the pot is about half, exactly half, from the neck to the middle of this pot here. And so we have some proportionality there. The concentric circles here up on the shoulders of the pot are mimicking the shape. They're not quite the same size as the opening, but they are the same size as the actual neck here, in order to kind of draw parallels between the various shapes on the pot itself. And then you've got down below the neck, in areas that would have been less seen if this was sitting on a shelf, smaller patterns that emphasize the length or the breadth of the pot down below. An amphora shape was oftentimes used to hold liquids. Wines were mixed in these, or mixed rather in a crater and then poured into these. They're also used in funerals, as we'll see in a moment here. Another example of geometric pots. All of the designs on these, by the way, have names. They are not, though, as we saw in Egyptian culture, symbolic of things in the real world. So while it might seem like this little zigzag down at the bottom or this long meandering line at the top is representative of water, there's no indication that that was in the minds of the Greek potters of the time. They just wanted to create beautiful designs on their pots to enliven them, to make them prettier. Some of the more complex pots, such as what you're looking at here, known as the Dibbleon Crater. It was found in the Dibbleon Gate, which is the gate that leads onto the Acropolis in Athens, have a lot of geometric designs of figures, and these types of figures show up on the pots right around the middle of the 8th century BCE. This pot is from around 750. The name of the pot, a crater, is a wide open-mouthed vessel, and so you see that here, meant to mix materials, or in this case to capture libations that were poured into it and then poured through holes in the bottom of it over the top of buried people. So at this time period, although Greece will move somewhere around this same moment from the practice of inhumation or burying bodies to the practice of cremation, these were very much meant to be grave markers. They would, kind of like a tombstone, sit over the burial of the deceased, usually, if it's this complex, a very important person, to mark the site of that grave, and then to pay tribute to the dead, you would pour liquid libations, wines, for instance, into this that would then pour down to the place of the deceased, which leads us to a question about how the Greeks viewed the afterlife. The Greeks view the afterlife not like the Egyptians did. Their afterlife, if you've ever read a Greek myth, is fairly bleak. Most people end up in Tartarus, which is their version of the underworld, and toil away there in a state of, well, nothing fun is going down there much. There are moments, though, in Greek mythology in which someone who is a very important person is said to escape from Tartarus into the lands of the Elysian. The Elysian is an area of the underworld that is more pleasurable, and in these places one would imagine that pots such as this might not be so dissimilar than the function of burying people in Mycenaean times with all the objects that they desired, or in Egyptian times of accompanying the dead with things that would give them pleasure in the afterlife. In this case, being buried with just your clothes, but being poured wine as if it were a tribute to give you something to do in Tartarus, is probably the idea that's going on here. We see in the main area of the pot, the area of the shoulders and the belly, the lower belly, a lot of figures. And what they're showing you here, amidst all the design elements that also accompany these figures, is a funerary procession. The funerary procession in which someone is carried to the bier. A bier is this part here, if you watch my cursor, or this part over here, this is just a close-up of this area, is a stand on which the dead body was laid so that people could pay tribute to it. Later on, a bier is associated with cremation, where people are placed upon a bier and then the body is burned in a ritual kind of send-off. We don't have evidence yet that cremation was used here. It probably was just a stand to place the dead on so that you could see him or her one last time before the send-off. The procession, which carries people to or from the bier, which we see on both sides here, although they've paused for a minute to show their grief, is known as a prosthesis, kind of like the prosthetic devices that we use today, although a prosthesis here is the carrying of a dead member of society to their funerary resting place. Looking at this more closely then, what we see is a very schematic rendering of human form. It's turned the body into geometric patterns. You see this in the torso, an inverted triangle. Everything is placed in geometric terms to define a human body. There's no indication of depth, for instance. Things that are further away are higher up in the scene, but there is no overlapping. There's no size diminution, making things smaller as they get further away. There is no attempt at foreshortening, which is to shorten a part of the body as it projects out into our space. Instead, not so dissimilar than Egyptian times, what we're trying to do is give you information rather than show you what something really looks like. And that's most indicative when you look at these horses. The horse here doesn't have 8 legs on the front and the back. There's 3 or 4 different horses all lined up here, and it's just meant to tell you there's a bunch of horses that would carry this charioteer to the procession. It shows you what the shields look like. Remember, these shields back from Mycenaean times continue to be used in Egyptian culture at this time period. The figures up above are pulling at their hair. This is a way of showing someone in mourning, as if they're so fraught with pain and grief that they pull their hair up. And the Greeks, of course, had very, very demonstrative funerary rites with them. People cried quite a bit. They let out what the Greeks called their pathos, their extreme emotion, to get that out of them kind of once and for all. Notice too, and we'll come back to this figure, that the types of forms that you find in bronze casting from early on, so back here, this centaur figure, which again is made up of basically geometrical units here, are mimicked in the painting of the time. We have the same type of form to render animals. Now, I don't think this is what any horse ever looked like, but it gives you the idea horse, and that's all that matters for them. This leads to another point, though. What are these things that are roughly from the same time period? They're bronze cast sculptures, all done in the cire perdu process, or lost wax casting process, that we've talked about a couple of times now, that represent either particular mythological stories. You should remember that the time of the Iliad is the time of archaic Greece, so Homer is writing down the Iliad and the Odyssey at the same time. The Greek myths are very much a part of Greek society at this time. Or they are meant to be a kind of metaphor. Centaurs, which are half men, half horses in ancient Greece, represent the bestial side of humanity. They are humans with a large degree of kind of animal instinct in them, a large degree of emotionality, a large degree of being ruled by their own passions and desires. The Greeks thought of the centaurs as something that needed to be tamed within all of us. We're not actual centaurs, but we all have these human penchants for things that we like, and overwrought emotions and things of that sort. The Greeks wanted to be a very rational human being. They wanted to be people whose mind ruled over their emotions, who could contain their excesses, and the centaur represented those excesses. In fact, Greek mythology, if you pay attention to it, is all moralizing. It's all about giving you lessons about how to be a better human being and the things to watch out for. So sculptures like this were probably, if not directly about a particular myth, certainly indirectly about wanted to show you this warrior as well. Again, very geometric, very patterned, not about creating a likeness of a human being, but just giving you the idea of a human being at this stage. Other bronze cast vessels or made vessels out of bronze are things like this. On the left-hand side is what is usually called a geometric tripod cauldron. Would have been used to cook or mix things heated over a fire. A very luxury item if it's made out of bronze. And then on the left-hand side, you see a griffin head protome. A protome is an object that it gets affixed to something else. And we don't know exactly what this was affixed to, but the Greeks really liked griffins. Griffins, of course, these eagle-headed chimeric animals who are made up of usually a eagle head or a vulture head along with a lion's body. We saw those in Mycenaean culture, for instance. So on with some of these vases. I've picked the ones that I thought were more interesting than just the geometrical patterning. So here we see a work by someone known as the Polyphemus painter. It is, again, a fairly early vase from about 670 BCE, an amphora, again, with that skinny head, where most of the action, most of the illustration is focused on the neck itself. Now, the myth that we're seeing here is the myth that comes out of the Odyssey. And I'll rehearse this for you a little bit so that you can get a sense of what the moral message is behind these types of pictures. Again, the stylistics are the same. These aren't particularly realistic, although you probably are noticing that as we move forward in time, they get more and more kind of lifelike. There is more attempt to show three-dimensionality. For instance, in the figure of Odysseus here in the foreground, where we see a leg jutting out from behind another leg with a contour line here in front of it showing us the idea of three-dimensional space. That's not to be found, for instance, on this figure next to him off to the other side. So, to the story, most of you will have heard that Odysseus is the kind of brains behind the Trojan War. He's the person who, through his own smarts, is able to end the Trojan War by coming up with the idea of the Trojan horse. As he is leaving Greece, so I should pause here, he's a representation of all the things about the rational mind that the Greeks wanted to cultivate, that they thought were incredibly important in human beings. But he's also someone who is prone to his own mistakes. And in the Odyssey, this is his big mistake that leads to all the trials and tribulations that keep him from his homeland for 10 years as he, tries to get back to Greece. On his way home, they stop on an island that is populated by, and it's Odysseus with his warriors, stop at this island populated by Cyclops, these gigantic figures with single eyes that are all seen to be relatives of the god Poseidon. The major Cyclops on the island is Polyphemus, and Polyphemus traps the Greeks in his own cave. And the Greeks are stuck there and they don't know how to get out. They're locked in this cave with Polyphemus and a number of sheep. And Odysseus figures out that what he can do is get Polyphemus really drunk so that he passes out. And when he passes out, they'll be able to find their way out. Well, Odysseus is also forward-thinking in this story, because when the Cyclops Polyphemus asks him who he is when they initially meet, Odysseus says, "Oh me, I'm nobody. My name is nobody." So keep that in mind. He's thinking about this whole stratagem of how to get out. After he gets Polyphemus drunk, and by the way, you can see this, there's a cup in his hand. This is one of these drinking vessels that we'll see coming up. He's gotten him drunk. Just like centaurs, Cyclops are prone to their animal passions. They drink too much. When he passes out, Odysseus heats up a sword in the fire in the cave and plunges it into Polyphemus's one eye. When Polyphemus wakes up screaming, of course he's blinded, he can't see, he reaches out blindly to try to find the warriors from Odysseus's camp. He can't find them, however, because they've all clung to the bottom of sheep. They're kind of hanging off the bottom of sheep, and so all he can feel are the backs of the sheep and nothing underneath. He figures they escaped, so he opens up the cave, and of course they escape on the bottom of the sheep. As he's running through the island screaming bloody murder, the other Cyclops come to ask him what they can do to help. "Who has done this to you?" they say, and Polyphemus says, "Nobody did this to me. His name is Nobody." And they all presume that it's just an accident. Again, smarts of Odysseus. But this is where things go horribly wrong. Odysseus escapes to his ships out in the harbor and can't leave the scene without claiming some degree of, fame for what he's done. And so as Polyphemus yells at him, "Who are you? What's your name?" and so forth, "Nobody, what's your name? Where are you from?" Odysseus can't help but say to him, "When people ask who escaped from you, who blinded you, don't tell them it was nobody. Tell them it was I, Odysseus." And so he gives Polyphemus' name straight out of the interest in fame, or what the Greeks call excessive pride, or hubris. Now in Greek mythology, when someone expresses excessive pride or hubris, they are going to be hit with nemesis, meaning the return of some kind of, horrible act upon them for being too prideful. And that's what, of course, befalls Odysseus as he travels from one problem to the next for the next 10 years, trying to get home to his mainland. Again, this is another amphora. This is the Netsos amphora from a little bit later in time. It's what's called a black figure painting. I don't want to explain this in detail here. There's a really good explanation for this in your textbook. But in brief, everything that you're looking at of color here, black or red, is caused by the actual clay itself and the way that it's fired. These things are fired in kilns, and what happens is that the areas that are black for you here, these figures up above of a centaur being kind of controlled by a warrior, again a symbol of taking control over our excessive desires, controlling or reining in our animal impulses. That's all created by taking clay and watering it down and then painting on the surface of the overall vessel in what's known as a slip, a watered down bunch of clay. The contours you may be able to see here are all incised in using a little needle to give basically little scratches in the surface of this. When the pot is then fired, depending upon how much oxygen is let in, the areas of the clay will go very red when a lot of oxygen is let in, or very black when very little oxygen is let in, but a high degree of temperature is attained. So what's happened here is areas that were painted with slip, just clay, it's not a pigment, when the oxygen is just decreased in the chamber, get really, really black, and then they're fired to such a high temperature that it glazes over with almost glass-like surface. And then when more oxygen is allowed in, that oxygen doesn't penetrate the black, it only penetrates the red clay and turns it a reddish color. The opposite will happen when you see red figure paintings. These are called black figure paintings, where the redness is caused by a slip that's been given a ton of oxygen but not fired to such a high degree as to turn it glass-like. And this is a close-up of this. So you see that, we've got the figure now getting even more realistic, the hand grabbing the hair to pull his head back, the foot being placed on the lower back of the figure that gives you some indication of space, and the sword being held against him. And what the centaur is doing here is begging, begging for something. You see also words on here. These are the words of the actual characters in these scenes, and oftentimes the words of the actual potters who created this. This one was created by Nessos, for instance. And this is Nessos right here. By the way, Not every pot was signed with a name. Many of the pots were just made for mass consumption, so what you're seeing in this class are the really fancy ones, the ones created by great artisans. This is a more advanced form of black figure pottery. This is the work called Achilles and Ajax Playing Dice by Ezekias. Ezekias was one of the best potters of the mid-500s BCE. His name is on a number of pots, and they're extraordinary in their detail and in the way he's able to render the human form, which, as you see, keeps getting more naturalistic. The subject here, again, it's an amphora. The subject here is taken from the Trojan Wars. Achilles is the major warrior of the Trojan Wars, and the one who in battle it can't be defeated, because the story has it that his mother, Thetis, took him to the river Styx when he was an infant and dipped him into the river Styx to make him impervious to all human weapons. The problem of this whole story, of course, and the end of Achilles will be that when mom dips him in the water, she holds him by the ankle, right around the Achilles tendon, which is where we get that term, and that area isn't covered by the water. And when he's eventually killed by Paris, who is the young prince of Troy, it's because a poison arrow is shot directly into that one place of vulnerability. Ajax is the second most powerful warrior, who ends up going mad and committing suicide when he is not gifted with the armor of Achilles that he believes should be his. What we see them doing here is, in between battles, playing either a game of dice, or most people today believe it's a game of backgammon, just having this kind of respite from the war. And think of how this would work then. The amphora might be filled with wine. You would see these scenes that would remind you of Greek mythology, and then you would pour the wine out of that and have a drink, just as these people are passing the time in between battles. Their spears are over their shoulders, their armor, or their helms anyway, are behind them, as are their shields, and they're just playing a game. If we get in here up close, you can see the amount of detail that now is accompanying these. Everything that's black, again, is slip. Everything that's red is slip, fired a slightly different way. And all these lines that describe the greaves, these are little pieces of armor that protect the shins, or the designs on the thighs here, or the beautiful designs that are all the way through their clothing, are all created by incising with a little needle and then painting very carefully with slip in between these things, and then firing in a 4-part process to create these types of colors. Just briefly, the next scene in this is, and it's not, these weren't one after another scenes, but the next scene in the story is that Achilles, when he doesn't receive, Ajax, when he doesn't receive Achilles' armor after Achilles is killed, goes mad. He kills a number of people. He is overwrought by pathos, that animal emotion that leads him to great shame. And in order to recuperate his great shame, he commits suicide. Now, we're not seeing a bloody scene here. What we're seeing instead is him placing the sword on the ground so that he can proverbially fall on his own sword, which will happen. His shield, which has a big figure of a gorgon on the front of it, another apotropaic device to ward off evil, we see off to the side. His helm looking at him, and we just get this moment of contemplation before the actual act is achieved. Another vase, again, a scene from the Greek mythology and the Trojan War by Ezekias, is the so-called Achilles and Penthesilea vase. Penthesilea was the queen of the Amazons, who Achilles had to defeat on his way to the Trojan War, and what you're witnessing here is him putting her to the sword. He's killing her. She looks back at him. She's, of course, rendered in white. It was common, as we've seen before, to render women in white and men in black, and he is, doing his duty. The stories have it, of course, that he fell in love with her before he had to kill her. And we see a little bit of that as their eyes lock. Remember in our first couple of meetings, and now it's going to be even more important, artists are able to achieve, your focus of your eye, and if you watch my cursor here, by creating what's called an implied line between figures that point or figures that look at each other. And this locking of gazes between the two speaks of a moment in time where they were at least lovers, if not in love. And now, of course, he has a duty to perform and must kill her. Around this are the names of the characters as well as the names of the vase maker. Further, you're probably starting to notice recurring patterns that become favorites of the Greeks, such as this one down here, which is called the meander pattern. Many of the vases, and I'll just show you a bunch of these, and you don't need to worry about the actual titles of these vases. There are literally hundreds of thousands of these, are associated with the Greek practice of the symposia. The symposia were basically male drinking parties where men would drink because it was actually believed that drinking wine could lead you into a creativity, lead you into higher forms of thinking. So they'd sit around and drink and talk philosophy and all manner of politics, but they'd also get rip-roaring drunk and invite prostitutes into these affairs and have kind of big orgiastic scenes and so forth as a form of revelry. Pottery was created to accompany the symposia, and what you're looking at here is, again, an amphora in which you see a banqueting scene by Euphronius. And in this scene, what people are doing is they're drinking and they're dancing and having fun. The symposia were meant to be fun, like a big party, but they are also a form of creative thinking. So here are a few of these. This is on the interior of what's known as a Kylix, an actual drinking vessel, a very shallow drinking vessel. And on the inside, you see a man dancing here over the top of a Kylix. He's just gotten out of his little kind of couch. And then over here, people playing instruments and dancing and drinking and basically reveling. Many times this is a Kylix form on the bottom and the scene that's inside of it up above. Many of these, and you can find them at the Seattle Art Museum for instance, will have at the bottom of the vessel the scene of a drunken satyr, which is what you see here, or a drunken centaur. You can tell he's a satyr by his pointed ears and his snub little nose and the fact that he's got a tail back here. And they're supposed to look drunk, like falling down drunk. Sometimes they almost look like they should have their eyes crossed out, because the idea was that you're supposed to revel, you're supposed to drink, but not to total excess. So if you're getting completely too drunk, you're missing the point of the symposia, which is to get yourself into basically a buzzed-like state and to talk philosophy and to have fun and to drink and to kind of loosen your inhibitions, but not go so far that you become like a drunken satyr. And that's what's being said here. If you drink your vessel, drink everything out of your vessel, and you see this at the bottom, it's a reminder to remain moderate. And the Greek term for moderation is sophrosune, to remain moderate in all things. You can drink, but you can't drink to excess. Which seems like a little bit of an irony, since these are ecstatic affairs where people drink a lot. You see another drinking scene here by the Brygos painter, where, again, people are drinking a ton. There's a skin of wine over here on the right that they're drinking out of. Being poured into this is a kind of flavoring agent. People are probably dressed up like satyrs or centaurs having fun in the revelry, but they're going a bit too far, and this is meant to remind you of moderation. The key to this is over here, by the way, the Greeks didn't shy away from sexual imagery, so the fact that this guy is balancing a drinking vessel on his erect penis is meant to say, you've just gone too far, buddy. And we see this as well. I just, don't mean to upset anyone, but you should be aware that Greek society did not have a problem with the representation of sexual activity particularly in scenes taken from the symposium. So you've got a Greek on the right, a reveler who's been drinking and talking politics, and now he is partaking with someone who is almost assuredly a prostitute or a heretai class person. And over here, you've got a really drunken person who has turned over his items of revelry. You've got the harp over here, and is being attended to by a young man who's allowing him to literally puke into this other vessel down below, a Kylix, or I'm sorry, a crater down below. So we'll pause here. In part 2 of this lecture, we'll return to talk about Greek temples.